It's 2001. You've just finished Final Fantasy X for the PlayStation 2. For the first time, characters in the Final Fantasy series look like real people. The cutscenes have actual voice acting. The CG cutscenes look nearly identical to in-game graphics. The possibilities for the future seem limitless. Years later, at an E3 in 2006, you are shown the future. A new character darts around an arena, populated with enemies, attacking, dodging, and summoning skills as though they are in an interactive movie. The title of the game is shown. Final Fantasy 13. This was the future, and you were so ready for it. But then it came out, and everyone hated it?
What?
So Final Fantasy 13 has seen something of a resurgence lately. It came as a surprise since I was under the impression those who played this game hated this game. The way that people spoke about it and its reputation seemed to support that at the time. Then, from the bowels of the internet, chatter began to emerge to contradict that idea. This alone prompted me to take another look at the game. Time has its way of changing our perspective on media, you know? Movies or television that was once considered terrible or amazing can often find perspectives on them shifting years later. What I found on this new playthrough was something interesting. Something I could not predict when I started. So, let me take you along on my Final Fantasy 13 journey and we'll make some interesting discoveries. Together. Part 1. A brief history lesson. Final Fantasy 13 was first shown off as a concept at E3 2006, and you'll notice some things in this trailer that do not appear in the final game in any way. This is because Final Fantasy 13 as a game largely did not exist at the point that this was announced. It was mostly an idea that had been put together with the PS2 framework in mind and a game scenario at the ready. This is what could be and what they wanted to make, not what actually existed as a complete gameplay experience. They would later attempt to build out the game to look and play like this demo. But as game development often does, things changed along the way, and the game evolved through necessity, regular decision-making, and console changes. This is not unfamiliar territory, as Square Enix has done this many times before, most notably with their FF7 Remake tech demo, which was not actually a game, but a visual demo of what could be. This is also precisely why people put such little emphasis and faith on seeing gameplay trailers nowadays that are just CG. Thanks, Square Enix. As time passed and the industry looked to their PS3-filled future, the decision was made to shift FF13 to the newest console and utilize their own internal game engine to speed up development. This engine was called Crystal Tools, and it was supposed to boast the feature of making effects easier and rendering CG in real time. But it was an internal tool that was still being developed, so it came with its share of, difficulties. PS3 infrastructure enhanced these difficulties. To break it down in the easiest way possible, the internal structure of how PS3 was built made coding simple tasks extremely cumbersome. So it often went underutilized compared to the resources in Xbox 360 and usually resulted in a worse gameplay experience. So, take a difficult console, pair that with a difficult game engine that has not reached the maturity of other game engines, and you have a recipe for a nightmare development cycle. But wait! Not only was this a nightmare development for one game, but 3. Before Final Fantasy 13 was even released, it was announced that they would use FF13 as a basis for a series of games that they called the Fabula Nova Crystallis series. According to interviews, these 2 additional games were stories that had the loose connective tissue of the Final Fantasy 13 world to tie them together, particularly the Crystals and the Fal'Cie. Final Fantasy Versus 13 was supposed to be a fantasy based in reality, where they would put a more realistic and dark tone to the Final Fantasy series as a whole. Strangely enough, this was supposed to take inspiration from Kingdom Hearts and set to feature characters in a more realistic setting. The trailers were completed by the team who worked on Advent Children and Kingdom Hearts, very obviously so, especially if you look at trailers like Deep Dive. The interview on Versus 13 are a little weird since Nomura struggles to even describe Versus 13 beyond what I've mentioned. He focuses on details like the character's unexpected personality and voice, while also seeing that the human experience and emotions would also play a larger part. The other game, Final Fantasy XIII Agito, did come out, sorta. It's a little confusing, but from what I gather, it was reworked into Final Fantasy Type 0. Then, Agito was released as a mobile title later set in Type 0's world. Final Fantasy XIII Versus was also cancelled, name changed, and heavily reworked in order to become Final Fantasy XV, which apparently people were saying it should be even before that happened. All of this prior to the game's release, mind you. You can understand how there was a lot of hype and expectations going into these releases. Now that we know a bit of history and some background leading up to the release, the question remains, Why did people hate this game? Well, the complaints from what I see come down to the characters and the gameplay. I could just launch into complaints, but I want to break down each part and examine them for what they are. We'll go over the narrative, the characters, additional content, and then the gameplay. I'll try to break down each in the most accessible way that I can. So, Part 2, an extremely basic story summary. Now that you have a bit of backstory, let's talk about the actual game, the plot. Final Fantasy XIII. What is it about? Well, there is a lot to the story, and it can get very confusing because of how it's written, presented, and named. Nor the character, nor the operation, and nor the paramilitary organization. Help me, why are things like this? Let's set the scene. In the story of Final Fantasy XIII, there are two worlds. One is the world of Grand Pulse, often abbreviated as Pulse, which is a lush planet filled with big creatures and endless nature. The second world is Cocoon, a microplanet that floats above the surface of Grand Pulse. It serves as a safe place for humanity. Cocoon is supposed to be a paradise in the sky where people live safe and comfortable lives away from the inhospitable planet below. The people of Cocoon are so terrified of Pulse, in fact, that they treat anything from Pulse with extreme fear and skepticism. They call it Hell on Earth. These two worlds are governed by godlike beings called fal'Cie. Both Pulse and Cocoon have their own fal'Cie that manage various aspects of each place. Food, electricity, weather, etc. But oh no! One day, a Pulse fal'Cie is found in Cocoon and everyone is frantic. It's from Pulse. It must be bad. People who think they have even so much as been in the vicinity of this evil Pulse creature are purged from Cocoon and shipped off en masse to Pulse to, die, probably? Or that's what everyone assumes. Our party, through plot happenings, find themselves in the presence of this Pulse fal'Cie, and they are collectively given a quest called a focus. It is not made explicitly clear to the audience what this focus is because it's not given to them in a traditional sense, such as orders of go here and do this thing, verbally, or even a written decree, nothing like that. Most fal'Cie don't speak the human language, so instead it's given to them in a vision. The party is collectively given a vision of them completing their focus, and they have to interpret what that means and how to achieve it. If they succeed at this focus, they are rewarded with immortality by becoming a crystal statue. If they fail at the focus, they become monsters called Seath. So there's not much winning here in terms of success for any of the people who receive a focus. Either way, they aren't given a choice. They can either complete the focus or become a monster. Is that technically a choice? And it just so happens that the focus they receive gives them a vision of what they interpret to be the destruction of Cocoon. The question Final Fantasy XIII poses is thus: what would you do if you were told the only way to get out of a death sentence is to do something horrific? Would you do nothing and await the inevitable end, letting this horrible task be passed on to the next person? Would you do horrible things to ensure your own survival? Would you sacrifice the safety and comfort of your life to rid yourselves of the shackles of control? Sounds like an interesting premise, doesn't it? Lots of tantalizing possibilities. But right off the bat, we're hit with a problem. The characters don't know what they are supposed to be doing with any level of certainty. They receive this vision of their focus, but they have to interpret it into a tangible task, and, as people often do, they have different interpretations of the same vision. Some characters come up with their own interpretation of the vision that means they need to save Cocoon, and others think they need to destroy it. Other party members don't have an opinion either way. They are seemingly content to go along for the ride and believe the interpretation from others. This is written as part of how the focus is given, but in my opinion, I don't think this was a good narrative decision. The narrative would feel stronger if we had some level of certainty about why we're doing what we're doing. This is made doubly so when the characters decide to reinterpret the same vision to mean something completely different without much reason other than because they want it to be that way. But forget all that, there's no time to waste. Since the party has come in contact with a Pulse fal'Cie, they are now seen as dangerous, scary, and summarily hunted by Cocoon's military. This is how you spend the first section of the game. It's spent with parts of the main cast as they try to avoid the military, and they interact with each other. They get to know other members of the party and each discover new powers they've been given, since, yes, those with the focus are bestowed with additional powers and the ability to summon an Eidolon. They're also given the title of l'Cie, which is not at all confusing at how similar it is to fal'Cie. Don't worry about it. Eventually, our party gathers together and finds themselves fleeing Cocoon to escape pursuit. In desperation, they flee to Pulse, knowing that descending to Hell is a risk they might not survive, but it's a risk they have to Actually, Pulse isn't that bad. It has lots of creatures for sure, but it seems pretty okay. They even discover that people live on Pulse, or did at some point in the past. However, the discoveries made that Cocoon is more of a cattle pen than a paradise. Humanity is being corralled within Cocoon in order to sacrifice them en masse. Why? Because the Fal'Cie want to summon the Maker back to the world, a being who disappeared long ago. The Fal'Cie believe that this can only be accomplished if they sacrifice the totality of humanity. This is why Cocoon exists, and this is why they are so well cared for on Cocoon. So the group decides that, yes, they will destroy Cocoon and free humanity from the Fal'Cie. Everyone can just live on Pulse and not be a human sacrifice. The party returns to Cocoon, makes their way to the capital, and destroys the Fal'Cie in order to save everyone from Cocoon. Roll credits! Now that you have a basic story summary, let's move on. Part 3. The Characters. We have a cast of 6 playable characters in this game. They are from a variety of backgrounds, ages, and occupations. I'll give you a little summary of each character and their motivations here so you can understand where they're all coming from. Lightning. I don't know where else to put this, but do you know they robbed us of muscular, buff Lightning? Anyway, our main character of the game, Lightning, is a member of the Guardian Corps, a security group in Cocoon. Lightning is a competent survivalist and a strategic thinker who isn't afraid of taking risks. It's even netted her the nickname in the Guardian Corps of the particularly dorky-sounding Captain Dangerous. Her methods can border on cutthroat, as she is not against leaving others behind if it means survival. Her real name is Claire, but as many protagonists with a backstory do, she has forgone that name in favor of the more cool-sounding Lightning. She considers abandoning her name as part and parcel of letting go of her childhood and becoming an adult capable of taking care of her younger sister named Sarah. Her goal through the game is to save her sister and survive this whole Lucy ordeal. When this game came out, there was a large outcry that she was just Cloud with pink hair and boobs, and I disagree with that sentiment. I know soldier types are limited to Cloud only, and aloof characters are just Cloud, and that's all we have to compare him to. But that might be a little inaccurate, actually, so I don't agree. I can see similarities in that they are both kind of aloof protagonists with military-esque occupations, sure, but they are wildly different characters. Lightning is a character that, honestly, Cloud would try and emulate more than what he actually is. She's cool, confident, strong, practical, capable on her own, and sane. Snow. Snow is a divisive character. He's Sarah's fiancé, and by extension, Lightning's soon-to-be brother-in-law. He's brash and doesn't think his actions through, and that tends to get the party, as a whole, in trouble. He listens to his gut and his heart. He is a bit of a main character complex since he insists on telling the characters in the game, and by extension the audience, that he is the hero and nothing will get him down. While that's all well and fine, his insistence at being a hero and forging ahead can often come at the cost of those around him, leaving them to clean up his messes or deal with the consequences because he didn't want to think things through. His goal through the game is to rescue Sarah, and he also wants to save Cocoon. So he's not a bad guy on its face, he does try his best, but sometimes... And can I just pause here and tell you how fucked up the relationship between Snow and Sarah is? In one of the novels, episode 0, yes, I realize I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but it gives us the backstory that Sarah and Snow had only just started dating prior to the beginning of this game. They hadn't told Lightning prior to the game, and then within a few hours, Snow proposes. So from Lightning's perspective, they go from dating to marriage in the span of the day. What the actual fuck? Saz is a guy who got dragged into all this. He doesn't want to be here, he wants to go home and take a nap, and I find that extremely relatable. His 6-year-old son became a lessee while he was taking him on a day trip to see the Fal'Cie who creates electricity. Dutch, his son, was taken by the military afterwards and used for his newly granted lessee powers. Saz didn't like his son being used by the military, kinda understandable, and he slipped away to complete his son's focus for him, or what he assumed to be the focus. No one really knows. And he met Lightning along the way and ended up with the main party. And that's kind of it. He's along for the ride for a long-term goal of saving his son. He's a good guy Saz. But I'd also like to randomly note that Saz has a chocobo because the concept artist drew a chocobo randomly next to his design. They decided to keep it, and I think that's adorable. Hope is a kid who also got swept up into circumstances. His story starts out with him on a vacation with his parents, where his workaholic father dips and leaves them to their own devices. When the Pulse fallacy is discovered, they are unlucky enough to be in the area, and then they are summarily purged as a consequence. That doesn't sit well with his mother, so she decides to try and fight in Snow's resistance faction, and it doesn't go very well. Hope's mother dies in front of him due to Snow's recklessness, I guess, and he spends the first part of the game having an intense murder grudge for Snow. At first, his motivation is to get revenge on Snow, and that motivation later turns to surviving and helping the party. Hope can be kind of annoying, but he's a kid who tries to shank a man like twice or 3 times his size, so you have to respect that kind of audacity. But he's also a 14-year-old kid who starts the game on vacation, loses his mom, ends up in a war, and is branded an enemy by the people just because he was in the wrong place in the wrong time. You know, maybe cut him some slack. His day is kinda sucking. Vanille. Vanille is a native of Grand Pulse, a former Lassie who has previously completed her focus and turned to Crystal. When she awakens again through mysterious means hundreds of years later, it sparks much of the events that gathers the party together and gets the plot going. She exists as sort of a fish out of water, a person who is within the stronghold of her longtime Cocoon enemies and doesn't know how to fit in naturally, so she can come off as a bit odd. Vanille acts upbeat and peppy, but that's probably to lampshade her guilt for being what has gotten others cursed by a falsy focus. She is described as helpful, cheerful, but an immense crybaby. At the same time, she was raised with a disdain for the people of Cocoon, given what the Cocoon falsy has done to her world. But in interacting with its people, she begins to question her opinion in considering them all enemies. Fang. Fang, much like Vanille, is a Lassie who has completed her focus and awoken again through mysterious means. However, she doesn't have any of the memories as it relates to her focus. Her childhood, combat skills, everything like that, is stuff that she remembers, just not anything focus related. This is not very well defined in the game, by the way. She dislikes everyone within Cocoon and considers them enemies to her people and to the world as a whole. On arriving in Cocoon, she's taken by surprise at how docile and uncombative the people and animals are, and she thinks of them as foolish and soft. Fang is incredibly blunt and no nonsense. She has an immense consideration for Vanille, but not as much care for her party members or the whole of Cocoon, or even the falsy. Her goal through the story is to make sure that Vanille completes her focus and that they can return home. Part 4. The Light Novels. The series has 2 light novels for the first game. Episode 0 is a prequel to the game where you get to see characters living their normal lives prior to the events of the game. It honestly reads like a collection of cutscenes that someone wanted to include but had to cut for the sake of time, resources, or money. I'll summarize each chapter briefly before we get into the gameplay because these stories are extremely important for contextualizing the world and understanding how these characters relate to one another. To be completely transparent, it was surprising just how much information was contained within these chapters that explained bits that were missing from the story. Encounter focuses on Lightning, Snow, and Sarah. You see Lightning doing her job as a member of the Guardian Corps, meet Snow for the first time, and see how Sarah obtained her brand. Strangers focuses on Vanille and Fang after they wake from crystal stasis. It provides backstory for the conflict between Cocoon and Pulse, the War of Transgression, and general backstory for the game. This scene alone would have provided so much context for the world and how it functions, especially the one about credit card fraud. Treasure follows Saz and Dodge through the experience of Dodge becoming a Lassie and being acquired by the military. It also explains the beginnings of why the Purge started, along with more about characters like Jill. Search is about multiple characters, but mainly Fang, Radia, I don't know, and Rains, Sid. You get a better handle on the politics in the world and how there are certain people within Cocoon who don't like the paradise that they have to endure. Friends is a Hope-centric story where you see him and a few of his classmates go on a guided tour of the Sunlit Waterscape. It gives information about Hope's past, his antagonistic relationship with his father, and a little bit on what the falsy do in Cocoon. Present shows Snow and Sarah shopping for a birthday gift for Lightning. At the same time, Snow shops for an engagement ring for Sarah. What the fuck? And lastly, tomorrow shows Fang and Vanille before they become Lassie. Fang walks right up to a falsy and yells at them on why they don't solve all the problems of their world with their godly powers. It goes about as well as you'd expect. Then there is another booklet called Episode 1. It's a short booklet about the events immediately after the conclusion of the game. It serves a little bit like an epilogue where you see the characters go their own ways. I think the most interesting part here is that it shows the events after the game and Lightning just walks off and ends up in a weird void. So those are the light novels that are translated into English that I could actually read. Now that we have taken a look at the characters and the story, let's look at what issues people have with these characters. I'll look at this in the context of the narrative and why these characters might be disliked and what could contribute to those opinions. Part 5. The narrative. The main complaints here are that the story doesn't make sense and that the characters are not likable. There's a few reasons as to why I think that is, both of which come down to the dialogue and the character motivations. This game was developed pre-2010, and Square Enix at the time had a very, distinct way of having their characters speak within games. They often wax poetically and have a very purple prose way of speaking. This would have worked fine when characters are not voiced, but having characters say some of these lines can come across as stilted and unnatural. It's not doing any favors in making characters very relatable after a point. Viewers just get tired and want them to move on already. But on top of that, much of what is said is confusing to first-time viewers. They are not going to know going in that they have to look at the data logs every time something happens, or to read the prequel novel to understand the backstory and motivations. So many times the viewer is not going to understand what characters are talking about, or why they're doing what they're doing. Here, I'll give you a clear example. Lightning decides at one point in the game to go to Sanctum and kill the fal'Cie. Take the fight to them, right? Well, to a first-time viewer, it's going to seem random and weird that she does that. 1, who the fuck is the Sanctum? 2, why would that solve our problem? 3, she has a kid with her, and abandoning him to do this seems mean. We don't have much context for how the world works or why this is important or impactful. We don't know why Lightning is doing this, so to us it comes out of nowhere. Now, granted, mystery is a staple in Final Fantasy games. You start off experiencing a new world with unfamiliar terms and features, which are gradually revealed to you as the game goes on. That does not happen here. Nothing is revealed later about this sudden motivation. Nothing is explained. It's just there, it happens, and then it unhappens. If you read all the supplemental material that is not in the game anywhere, you come to understand that Lightning is so unbelievably angry in this moment about her sister being turned to crystal that she is fine with killing everyone on Cocoon for revenge. But also, if you read deeper in other material, you understand that fal'Cie can influence the emotions of anyone who has been branded, so she is likely having her emotions manipulated in the scene by a fal'Cie to do all this. No viewer is going to know that going in. There is no way to know on a first playthrough all of that. All we know is Lightning is going to try and kill a guy, and that's unpleasant to watch. Since this information does exist somewhere, it can be wonderful for those who like piecing stories together or seeing the same thing from a different angle. But for those who are playing it straight through and have no intention or knowledge that other material exists, it can come across as frustrating, unsatisfying, and unpleasant. We have to assume that this is who Lightning is because we are not given a point of reference otherwise. And this happens for basically every single character in this game, to some extent. So it's pretty understandable why there are people out there who don't like these characters, because sometimes they are presented in an unlikable way. We don't know why they're doing what they're doing sometimes. It seems to come out of nowhere because it's not really explained to us. Maybe we'll get a line, maybe we won't. Maybe you have to read the supplemental 200-page novel to get all the context. It varies. Frankly, parts of this story are missing from the game as it stands. I'm not sure what happened in production, but playing through the game made it obvious that there were necessary parts of the story and character motivations that were just completely cut or missing. In playing it again, I had to assume that localization or development went so poorly that they were desperately cutting scenes together in an attempt to make something that looked like a complete narrative that made sense. And in researching that, well, what do you know? There were issues in development that forced localization to switch the narrative altogether completely while they were writing it. I found this interview on RPG Gamer from several years ago by a localizer who worked on the project, whose name is Tom Slattery. Here is some of what he said about the localization of Final Fantasy XIII. From a localization perspective, that game was an absolute logistical nightmare. I understand any complaints people may have had with the localization from the outside looking in. They are entirely valid. From the inside, knowing what we had to contend with, I am amazed at the level of work we managed to produce. And this is where you start to put together the pieces of why the game is like this. Game development is a long, complicated, and often messy process, Many games don't even make it to a playable state until the thing is close to being completed. To have an engine that was still in the works, an overly complex PS3 infrastructure, and have the story developed alongside a developing gameplay must have meant that they were making up parts of the story as they went along, because other parts were meant to support it and they weren't finished. Slattery's viewpoint seems to support this. Final Fantasy XIII, since the localization was done in tandem with development, there was never a time when the Japanese version was completed and we could just sit back and think about what we wanted to do with ours. We simply churned along, translating, and then retranslating, and then retranslating again, as changes rolled in from all directions, or snuck in under our noses. This means that they were developing a game without a consistent vision in mind. So you could have accepted a term or ability or a motivation 1 minute that gets changed or contradicted later down the line. You can see this in instances like in the beginning of the game or reveal trailer where Lightning has this anti-gravity ability. This seems like it would have been an important component to the gameplay and would work its way into the game with what Lightning does. But if they couldn't get it to work in the gameplay, then it seems like their solution would be to write it out. But knowing this, and that's the development process that the story had to endure, makes so much sense. After a while, speaking from experience, constant changes make you forget the narrative you're even telling. Like, was this cutscene current, or was that 3 versions ago? Did we include this change? Is that change not even relevant anymore? Which scene was the one that actually ended up getting implemented? You don't really know sometimes. It makes telling a cohesive story a nightmare for everyone involved. Slattery confirms this later in the interview. Cutscenes were still changing after we completed the English voice recording. We probably translated the entire voice script about 4 or 5 times. We would translate blindly from text and then see an early render and say, oh no, that doesn't work, better rewrite that scene. Then some placeholder audio would show up and we'd realize our lines probably wouldn't match the timing or the emotion that would be on the characters' faces. Rewrite it again, and then rinse. Repeat with the final audio, motion capture, and endless fine-tuning. If you play this game in one sitting, you will see so many examples of obvious rework. A character has a motivation, says a thing, and then completely contradicts themselves or resolves the said issue within an extremely short amount of time, sometimes within the very same scene. But this is the sacrifice that the team had to make in order to get something finished. They took an extremely impossible situation, tried to glue this narrative together the best that they could, and managed to make a loosely fitting story. Despite the misgivings on some of the characters and the plot, I give the team who work on this extreme kudos and slack for this alone. What we could have gotten could have been so much worse if not for their hard work, but the fact that there is any connective tissue between these scenes at all is nothing short of a miracle when I read this. Other games do come together all the time and give us focused narratives, sure, but if this was such a horrible job and such a horrible game, why do people still talk about it all these years later? Could it mean that others found something rewarding, intriguing, and inspiring about the narrative as it stands? There has to be something here. It's something to think about. Part 6. The gameplay. The next complaint people have is about the gameplay. This includes the combat within the game as well as the level design. Final Fantasy XIII uses a hybrid battle system that includes turn-based action with a loose class system. You're pre-assigned roles to something called a paradigm and can switch freely between them in battle. This means that you can switch characters between healing, DPS, or tanking as needed, assuming that you've unlocked it, of course. When you engage in battles, you gain points that you can spend to level classes. You do this on the, Crystarium. That allows you to customize characters to your preferred playstyle. It reminds me of something. There's another game with a hybrid battle system that uses turn-based action with a loose class system. Oh, right, Final Fantasy X-2, which is regarded as one of the best turn-based battle systems in the Final Fantasy series. So, why is this one considered to be bad and the other, extremely similar one, so well regarded? I think more so that it's everything around the battle system that makes it feel more cumbersome in comparison. For example, Final Fantasy XIII, you have to switch classes in pre-assigned sets rather than switch them individually. Upgrading weapons and accessories is a confusing and obtuse process for those unfamiliar, and enemies can be extremely easy one moment, and then extremely difficult the next moment for no reason. Oh, god damn it. Comparison aside, enemies in this game are damage sponges to the point that bosses can take 30 minutes or so to complete. Given that each of them have a soft enrage and that they can cast doom on your characters, it can be frustrating to spend so long to get to an end of a battle only to be handed a loss because of a doom. It's actually a surprisingly difficult game on easy. My theory is that the developers tested for difficulty. And when people who make the game test the game, they know all the exploits, they know how it works, and it's easier for them than it would be for another person. I think if they modified some of these restrictions, people would be more on board with this battle system. Then there's the level linearity, which I also don't get. Look at this. Look at this map. Y'all like Final Fantasy X so much. Where do you want Titus to go here? The linear path? Look at these maps. Look at the straight lines. They're straight linear paths. Other Final Fantasy games prior to this can be linear. The linearity helps them keep tightly focused gameplay experience so the narrative can be the focus. It's not something new, and it's still happening with games like Final Fantasy VII Remake. Could level design be different? Sure. But it seems like others are more critical of it in this game than they have been in other places. To be fair, I think other Final Fantasy games are better at lampshading linearity than this one. This might be a path in Final Fantasy X where you go from point A to point B, but you also have a vertical path or a lower path for some variety. When it happens in 13, yeah, it can have that, but it's a little less organic. Ultimately, this game is guilty of being linear, yes. But that is not new in Final Fantasy games. In response to this, I think they tried to go in the opposite direction for Final Fantasy 15, where they provided the player with a vast open world, and everyone complained that it was boring and empty. So, now that we've taken a look at the story, the characters, and the gameplay, let's try and dissect this. Why did everyone hate this game on release? Part 13? Hating this game? So here we are at the crux of the problem. Why was this game so hated? I thought I would look into this, see gripes about the battle systems and the characters, then I would find that everyone likes it now because everyone misses turn-based combat, or something. But in going through all of the past information, the game reviews, the comments from back then, I actually found quite the opposite. Game review sites praised it. Reviews gave it consistently high remarks, which, okay, game review sites can often softball criticism, fine. So I went to look through user comments and reviews, but they were also extremely high and welcoming to this game. Like, there were comments on both sides, sure, but most of the comments were positive. There were not as many negative comments as I thought there would be. So why did everyone hate this game? I don't think everyone did. I think the hype around this game gave people unrealistic expectations. It wasn't what people thought it would be. That overshadowed what people felt about it. And the truth is, people loved this game then, and they love it now. There is something fascinating and earnest about this game despite its flaws. Look at all the beauty that exists here, and the intrigue that is just out of sight. Look at the passionate community that still exists around it. This game serves as a reminder that flaws in something can make it just as memorable as perfection. And I think that's a lesson worth remembering. If you got this far in the video, thanks for being here. It's the first video essay I've tried to make. Hopefully it comes out well. If you want to support the channel, like and subscribe. There will probably be a link tree down below where you can watch me on other things, like Twitch, or other social media disaster platforms. I don't know. But again, appreciate it. Hope to make more, and I will hopefully see you later. Thanks. Bye.